What's up, everybody? Gonna have to get out your static decoder rings for this one. I understand some people can come on here and talk about whatever they want, but once you attain my lofty status, according to the algo, then the slightest mention of certain time frames will get you ghosted. But it's actually really easy to follow along, and just so you know, NASDAP is the actual name of what everybody knows as the other word. They were never actually called that. And they say that it is slang for someone who is slow or stupid, but I think the real meaning behind that is because the Ash afterwards turned their memory and legacy into their Bix. And guess what? Those people have controlled the press in this country for well over 100 years, as well as textbooks, movies, radio, list goes on and on. And I'll just refer to them as the Greys because they love it when you attribute everything to little spacemen. Sorry, we don't have an extraterrestrial problem. We have an economic terrestrial problem. That's why the biggest thought crime of the last 100 years has been to even mention the Greys in any way, shape, or form. So everybody out there is big mad right now because the tycoon had a gathering at Madison Square Garden, and I'm surprised anybody had the gall to bring up this 1939 event and try to use it to disparage them. Because if you actually look into this, you're going to find that history is very different from what you've been told. But let's start out with a little recap of world history leading up to this time frame. We're going to start all the way back in the 1860s Civil War time frame. Everybody's seen Gangs of New York, probably. Well, there's a scene in there where all the noobs are coming in from overseas, and as soon as they step foot on U.S. soil, they're drafted into the Union Army. Well, that actually happened. This was before any labor laws or anything like that, and these industrialists ran all of the big cities in the North. These industrialists were absolutely ruthless people. If you've ever heard the term business is war, it absolutely is, and it's still going on today. They are conquering real lands with real estates, only now they're using fictitious fiat digital dollars instead of cannons. They were appropriately named by the public the robber barons. We have these megalomaniacs basically every couple generations, and they were just as well liked back then as they are today. But the name of the game back then was cheap labor, so they were bringing them in by the millions. The game doesn't change, just the tactics do. So the people that had lived in these cities for generations demanded a respectable living standard. So they went over to other countries, conned a bunch of people into coming to the promised land, where they were forced to take jobs for 10% of what the locals were used to making. Well, the majority of these imports just happened to be around the right age to throw in a uniform. So that's what they did, and they sent them down south to plunder all their wealth. And yes, this is exactly what it sounds like. They imported whole battalions to use against their fellow countrymen. Sound familiar? Now, here's why I'm telling you this, aside from everybody needs to know this. A huge number of these men were from the Big G. They say 216,000, but who knows? They were just bringing them in wave after wave, and there was nothing the South was going to ever do. There were just more coming. So at least 10% of the Union Army was from the Big G in the 1960s, and then this continued. Actually, after the Civil War, they really ramped things up. After that, they owned most of Washington and were able to just open the floodgates. So at least 6 million came from Jeezy. Guess what the biggest ethnic group in America was in 1910? Yep, the Big G's. This is just prior to World War I, which started in 1914. So a huge number of Americans still supported and respected their fatherland prior to and throughout both of the dub-dubs. But you have been told that everybody despised the G's. And I can't say this enough, forget everything that you have ever heard about this time frame. All of it was completely made up afterwards. Here's a map that you're never going to find in your textbooks, but this should be the first thing you see when opening a book about this time frame. There had been comrade revolutions in almost every country in Europe. And this is after hundreds of years of plotting that had taken out all of the monarchies. Pretty much every king and queen had been expelled from their own kingdom by this time. Charles of Austria was the last of the Habsburgs, who were the last ruling dynasty of Europe. I have this big, huge book of all the newspaper articles as events happened. And when you read the articles being printed in America, you can see just how much the Prop G was being thrown out. So after WWII, Charles of Austria was exiled. Well, guess who had all of their people in all the right places to take power after this? I'm going to blow through a whole lot of history right here in just a few seconds. The G's had all but won WWII by 1917. They invented and perfected the submarine, and nobody else was prepared for that. They were absolutely dominating. Well, the financial institutionalists of GZ wanted the comrades to take control of G, so they called their American cousins on Wall Street and had them put pressure on the president to join the show. And eventually, everybody in the public realized what had happened. Just like today, everybody's watching what's going on while a different story is being told. So the press writes these off as RWCs. And let me ask you, why are there never any LWCs? It's because they're always the ones causing the revolution. But everybody knew that they had been sold out, and this is referred to as this. The Americans got involved, and then the GZs lost, and then the machine kicked into vendetta, make them suffer mode, and that's exactly what they did. Everybody's heard of the Weimar hyperinflation bubble. It's because they did a hit on their economy. All kinds of crippling sanctions, reparations, and everybody's heard how they were trying to make the master race, right? That is absolute BS. They had lost all of their young men during WWII, and they were trying to repopulate their country and were incentivizing young families to have children. But everybody sees today how events get completely twisted around, and this has been going on for a long time. So people were struggling to survive. Their cities were being flooded with all kinds of addictive substances. And exactly like today, all of these alternative lifestyles were being glorified in all publications there. It's the exact same playbook as today. Well, traditionalists were sick of it. They had had it. And I hate to keep saying this, but just like today. But, of course, this is how the American press portrays this down at the bottom here. Older GZs are attracted to his vitriolic dislike of Greys, war reparations, and the parliamentary forms of government. Now, what they're calling parliamentary forms of government are the comrades. So from day one, Americans were being browbeaten with this Prop G, and in spite of everything that you've heard, they weren't buying it, just like today. GZ was basically a failed state by 33, and a certain Austrian painter came along and made a complete 180 and got the country back thriving, not just operating, but thriving. That's why he was 1938 Time Magazine's Man of the Year. Why am I not surprised that the checkers have labeled this misleading? Of course, today they say, well, Time Magazine supported G-Side in 1938. No, it's because that story hadn't been invented yet. And trust me, it was invented. I can go through every little detail, the fumigation tents and the BS that people were just rounded up wholesale just because of the way they were born. No, those facilities were for comrade revolutionaries, and it just so happens that a large percentage of them were gray. The real reason that he was Man of the Year was because he and his team, the NASDAP, had done a miraculous turnaround in GZ. And the whole world knew it, especially in America, where at least 10% of the population had their roots there. Guess where these 1,000 uniformed men are marching? New Jersey. Now, I want you to just imagine if that happened today. Can you just see the heads exploding? And man, they would be going through phone records and everybody in attendance here would be rounded up. Guys, we don't even realize how much our rights have just been absolutely trampled on in this country. Last year or two, there was the bumbling JoJo on TV saying, well, yeah, but back when the Constitution was written, you couldn't buy a cannon. Actually, I don't feel like digging it out right now, but I have the old newspaper clipping where cannons were for sale by the pound. Now, let's keep going. This looks kind of like the same picture, but this is Long Island. Another one here in New York. These were actually going on all over New York. Here in LA. And this was happening all over America. Millions and millions of people supported G. We've even got Chief Red Cloud that supported the NASDAP, and they actually made him an honorary member, in spite of everything you've ever heard about them despising every other flavor out there. They had a great deal of respect for the Native Americans. Now, you've been told your whole life that America got into Deuce to go save the poor Greys, when the truth is, I'd say less than 1% of people even knew anything about that, because it wasn't really happening. They were just political prisoners. And it wasn't because they were gray, it's because they were comrades and they just happened to be gray as well. So they played stupid games, they won stupid prizes. Now, in 39, when this meeting was taking place, the U.S. had about 190,000 boots ready to roll. In the next 3 years, they more than 10x'd that. And it wasn't because everybody had to stop the guy that was trying to take over the world. That was invented later, and I'll back that statement up in a second. It's because everybody was propagandized or forced to go over there. Now, to back up my previous statement that nobody was trying to take over the world, and the bias in all of this reporting is just undeniable. They write, AH is bristling at the rejection of his peace offer. They're celebrating that his peace offer got turned down. And to the right, the French premier says no real justice and lasting peace would be possible until he was defeated. Do you know what his and the people of G's real crime was? It was to boot the international financialists, who were the ones behind all of the comrade revolutions. So while all of the paid Muppets' heads are exploding over this right now, it just makes me laugh. And none of them actually understand the history of this time frame, or they wouldn't be bringing it up, because if people start looking into this, they're going to find out. I mean, just right off the bat, you're like, wait a minute, why are there so many people in America that are supporting this? Well, it's real simple, because the story that you and I have been taught our whole lives wasn't even invented yet. At this time, when somebody mentioned the NASDAP, people thought, hell yeah, those guys just went from a bankrupt, busted state to being a world industrial superpower in a matter of years. You know, the same 1930s market crash that happened here in America happened around the world. And people knew exactly who was behind this financial manipulation. They saw it bring Jeezy down to its knees, and they didn't want it to happen here. But yes, I just wanted to show you guys that millions and millions of people's parents and grandparents came here from G. And all of these stories that you hear about the NASDAP today, they weren't much talked about in the 90s when I was in school. And that's because millions of witnesses were still alive at that time and were disputing what was being claimed. Only it was literally illegal to even talk about it in a lot of European countries. But around that time was, my grandparents, the end of my grandparents' generation. And once they were gone, then they really started. I mean, they've changed all the documentaries. There's been a complete shift from the actual facts to what they would have you believe. I've got a lot more to say about this subject, but I can't just do these back to back for obvious reasons. But if you're new around here, go ahead and stick around for a little while. We'll cover some other cool history things, and I'll have a lot more information about this woven in there. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Static out.